Hello and welcome to a very important lecture on very important respiratory system, anatomy, physiology, and pathology topics. So, the respiratory system, in order to understand it, we have to divide it into anatomical part, anatomy, then we have physiology, and then we have pathology. So, we will be concerned with respiratory system anatomy, respiratory system physiology, and respiratory system pathology. So, the respiratory system anatomically is divided into two parts. There is the upper respiratory tract, the URT, the upper respiratory tract, and that begins from the nose passing through the nasopharynx, followed by the oropharynx, then the laryngopharynx, and ending at the larynx. So the nose is the first part of the respiratory system, while the larynx is the last part of the upper respiratory system. Then the lower respiratory tract begins right below the larynx at the trachea, and ends from the trachea and going through the bronchial tree, and ending all the way down at the alveoli. So we have an upper respiratory tract URT and the lower respiratory tract LRT. We also have a physiological classification of our respiratory system, and that will be we have a conductive respiratory system or a conductive zone, and we also have in the end respiratory zone and the respiratory zone. And it's very interesting that the conductive zone includes everything from the nose, passing by nasopharynx, passing by oropharynx, passing by laryngopharynx, passing through the trachea, passing through the bronchioles, the terminal bronchioles. All of that is just the conductive zone. And in the end, we have the respiratory zone, and that is just the alveoli. How interesting is that? That the whole respiratory segment of your physiological respiratory system is only your alveoli. Everything else is just the conducting zone. And remember, this conducting zone is mainly concerned with the passage and the delivery and the conduction of air to the alveoli and the removal of air from the alveoli and sending it into the atmosphere. So we take oxygen through inhalation from the air and we deliver it through all of our conductive zones, all of our anatomical dead spaces, the nose, the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, the laryngopharynx, the trachea, the bronchioles and the terminal bronchioles. All of that is conduction, and then we deliver it to the alveoli where respiration takes place. Then the alveoli will give off their carbon dioxide, and carbon dioxide will pass up through the terminal bronchioles, and then the bronchioles, and then the trachea, the larynx, the oropharynx, the nasopharynx, and the nose, and back out into the atmosphere. But remember that the conductive zone is not only responsible for conduction. The conductive zone is also responsible for humidification or humidifying the air, air conditioning, air conditioning. Because remember, patients who have a tracheostomy tube, they bypass the nose, the larynx, they bypass the nose, the oropharynx, the nasopharynx, the laryngopharynx, and the larynx, and the air immediately goes into the trachea. So a huge part of the conductive respiratory system is bypassed. Those patients, they found out in experiments that these patients are more prone to infections. These patients are more prone to infections, and these patients are actually more prone to upper and lower respiratory tract infections. And the reason for that is because it turns out that the conductive zone is responsible for taking the cold air in the winter and air conditioning it and humidifying it and making it physiological temperature so that it does not become a source of stress to my lungs. And in the summer, when the air is so hot, your respiratory conductive zone is responsible for making the air physiological, not too hot. Because remember, hypothermia, too cold, hyperthermia, too hot, that is a form of stress. Stress leads to cellular stress, leads to tissue stress, leads to cell injury, leads to tissue injury, then leads to cell death, and then tissue death, and that leads to inflammation, and so on and so forth, and necrosis, and so on and so forth. So patients who have a tracheostomy tube, who are lacking air passing through all of these important conductive system pathways, they are more prone to diseases. Also, they are more prone to infections, because it turns out that these conducting zones, they are also immune zones, because in these mucosa, you have immune cells that are part of your innate immunity. They are responsible for surveillance and screening the air that is coming into your upper respiratory tract and your lower respiratory tract, screening that air for any microbes, any bacteria, any virus, any parasite, any form of a damaging microbe, and they destroy it. So patients who have a tracheostomy tube are more prone to infections. So we realize that this conductive zone is not just strictly and exclusively concerned with conduction. It's also important for humidification and also important for immunological surveillance activities. You must also understand that when it comes to pathology, the pathology of the respiratory system is a combination of both. A combination of the respiratory anatomy, where we have upper respiratory tract infection, upper respiratory tract infection, and we also have a lower LRI, lower respiratory tract infection. And these infections affect anatomically. I can have infections. I can have trauma. I can have inflammation, pathologically speaking, in the nose, the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, the laryngopharynx, in the larynx, like laryngitis. I can have a problem in my trachea. I can have a foreign body lodging on the right lung. The foreign bodies, nickels, dimes, are on, more likely to fall and be displaced and locate in the right side of the lung. So I can have a defect that is in my upper respiratory tract and a defect on the lower respiratory tract. I can also have a defect on my conducting zone. I can have a problem with the conduction, because I know that when we are smoking, that smoke can damage. What is the histology of the cells within my nose? These are pseudo stratified epithelium. In my oropharynx, I have also pseudo stratified epithelium. And in my larynx and in my trachea, I begin to develop stratified squamous epithelium. So, any damage, defect, or inflammation in these physiological regions can cause a pathology for me. In the lower respiratory tract, I have rings, I have cartilage rings surrounding my trachea, holding it in place. Otherwise, it will fall and collapse. The trachea will fall and collapse. And I do not want my trachea to fall, and I do not want my trachea to collapse, and therefore there is there are very important cartilage rings around my trachea holding it in place so that the air passing through it does not cause it to collapse, and that ultimately unfortunately leads to a form of obstruction, a form of an obstruction. So it's very important to also consider that in my lower respiratory tract I have a trachea, and then I have my lungs. So in the lung, I am susceptible to bronchitis. I am susceptible to COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, or emphysema. These are diseases that affect, or pneumonia. These are diseases that affect the parenchyma of my lungs. So we will talk about them in detail. It's very important for you to understand that in my respiratory system, it's very important to understand that in the respiratory system, we must understand that the flow of air from the atmosphere into the lungs and the flow of air from the lungs outside to the atmosphere is actually very regulated and obeys basic physics laws. We know that fluids, whether liquid fluid or gas fluid, will never move except from an area of a high pressure to an area of a lower pressure. We know that air will not move, gas will not move except from an area of a higher partial pressure to an area of a lower partial pressure. So, what compartments am I mainly concerned with? The first compartment that I am mainly concerned with is my alveoli. The alveoli is the compartment number one. The second compartment is the blood vessels. And the third compartment is the tissue. So now I have gas fluid flowing, representing oxygen, all the way from the atmosphere through my conductive system to my lungs, then from my lungs into the circulation, pulmonary circulation, and then returning into the heart, and then all sent into the tissues. What governs that movement? Now let's find out what governs that very important movement. First of all, I have the alveoli. This represents my alveoli. And this represents my blood vessels. And this right here represents my tissue. My tissue. And these dots represent my nucleus. The dots represent the nucleus. The dots represent the nucleus. So these tissues are utilizing oxygen. So they use oxygen and they get and they generate carbon dioxide. They use ATP and generate ADP. They generate biphosphoglyrate, which is a metabolic waste. Negative, negative. That's a toxic thing. Negative. Biphosphoglyrate, representing metabolic stress. Metabolic stress. And carbon dioxide, elevating the hydrogen protons in my tissue, elevating carbon dioxide, and so much ATP being converted to ADP, because we said that in order to convert reactants into products, there is an activation energy, EA, an activation energy barrier that must be surmounted in order to go from reactants into products. What enzymes do, they decrease that activation energy barrier, and they make the reaction take an alternative route by providing a shorter activation energy to be surmounted, and that will generate for us products from these very important reactants. So those enzymes, they need ATP, and that's all happening in the tissue. Those activities powered by our enzymes, they are life sustaining activities. These life sustaining activities require ATP, and then they generate ADP. In order for me to switch back ADP into ATP, I'm going to need oxygen. I need oxygen for aerobic metabolism. I need oxygen because oxygen is the final electron acceptor in the electron transport chain. I need oxygen because oxygen is important for oxidative phosphorylation. So oxygen is very important. So I need to breathe in oxygen through the inhalation. Otherwise, ADP will overaccumulate. Carbon dioxide will overaccumulate. And if carbon dioxide overaccumulates, we will have an overaccumulation of hydrogen protons, and that increases acidosis. All of these are very toxic environments requiring oxygen supply. So now this tissue that is undergoing all of this stress, when you compare the of oxygen partial pressure of oxygen and the partial pressure of carbon dioxide. Let's begin with oxygen. Do you think the partial pressure for oxygen in the tissue that is undergoing so much metabolism and catabolism, that is generating so much BPG, generating so much carbon dioxide as a byproduct, do you think the partial pressure is high there? Of course not. The partial pressure is really low. The partial pressure is really low in the tissue compartment because oxygen is being consumed. Wherever there is a high consumption of a gas, the partial pressure there will be so low. And whenever there is no consumption of a particular gas, the partial pressure for that gas will be high. That's why near the lungs, when you take a deep breath, you have a lot of oxygen in the base of the lungs because you inhaled a lot of oxygen. So the partial pressure over there will be really high because you haven't consumed the oxygen. But over at the tissues, you're running and you are consuming so much oxygen, consuming so much aerobic metabolism, consuming so much oxidative phosphorylation, and converting ATP to ADP, generating so much carbon dioxide as a byproduct, and generating so much metabolic waste, and generating so many metabolites like BPG. Over there, obviously, the partial pressure for oxygen is low. And then the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood will be obviously much higher than the partial pressure of oxygen in the tissue. And in the alveoli, when you take in a deep breath, you bet that the partial pressure for oxygen is the highest. And I know from my physics that fluids, whether liquid fluids or gas fluids, these fluids will never move except from an area of a high pressure to an area of a low pressure. So here my oxygen flows nicely from the alveoli where there is so much, so high oxygen partial pressure to my blood vessels that have a lower partial pressure of oxygen, followed by in the tissue that has the lowest the lowest oxygen partial pressure. So now we see the direction of the flow of oxygen is from the alveoli down concentration gradient to the blood vessel and then to the tissue. You also remember that the process by which fluids, whether gas fluids or liquid fluids, they will only move, they will only move through the process of diffusion. So, oxygen, this gas fluid will diffuse from the alveoli, then it will diffuse through the blood vessels, then it will diffuse from the blood vessel into the tissues. Now, what about carbon dioxide? Well, here in the tissue that is undergoing aerobic metabolism, you have so much carbon dioxide being generated. So how is the partial pressure of carbon dioxide compared to the partial pressure of oxygen? The partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the tissue is going to be extremely high, is going to be the highest, because the tissue is undergoing so much aerobic metabolism, utilizing so much oxygen and giving off as a result carbon dioxide. And all of this carbon dioxide now is going to be accumulating in the tissue along with metabolic waste. And whenever you have carbon dioxide, that means you have bicarbonate, H2, H3CO2, and that will dissociate into CO2 and H plus, and H plus increases acidosis. H plus increases acidosis. Okay, so now the partial pressure for carbon dioxide will be the highest in the tissue, and then it will be a little low in the partial pressure in the blood vessels will be a little bit lower. The partial pressure will be a little bit lower, leading to the movement and the diffusion of carbon dioxide from the tissue into the blood vessels, and then from the blood vessels into the alveoli that has the lowest partial pressure of carbon dioxide, so it can make its way out through the alveoli and then up through the lower respiratory tract and then up through the higher or the upper respiratory tract. This is a very, very important concept for you to understand, that we utilize this pressure gradient physical characteristic of fluid movements, and we know that air is a gas fluid, and oxygen and carbon dioxide alike, they both move from an area of a higher pressure to an area of a lower pressure. That is very important. Then you must also understand that the tissue is generating so much metabolic waste. The tissue is generating so many metabolites like biphosphoglycerate, BPG. The tissue is undergoing an increased temperature. So when you are running the marathon, this skeletal muscles are going to be very hot because they are undergoing so much metabolism, so much breakdown of nutrients that are being converted into ATP. You have the lipids going through beta oxidation to provide ATP, and then you have your carbohydrates going through glycolysis to provide ATP, and you have protein catabolism to provide ATP. So much action to provide ATP that leads to increased generation of metabolic waste, and that also leads to high temperature and leads to a drop in oxygen saturation in the tissue, and also that leads to an increase in so much metabolic waste buildup, and also an increase in carbon dioxide concentration. And then an increase in carbon dioxide concentration translates into a high partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the tissue, and then the flow of the carbon dioxide will be from the tissue through the blood vessels and then out up to the alveoli to be disposed out from the body. Then you have the oxygen. In the oxygen, you have the partial pressure of the oxygen will be the highest in the alveoli, and it will because it's not being consumed in the alveoli, it will be the highest, and with the most concentration it will diffuse through the blood vessels to go and nourish this tissue that is undergoing so much aerobic metabolism and is going through so much oxidative phosphorylation and to help it with the generating with the respiration, providing it with the oxygen. That's a very important thing for you to know. So tissues that are undergoing so much metabolic activity, like I said, skeletal muscle tissues in a marathon, obviously their temperature will be higher compared to when you are resting and digesting. You are in the couch and eating. Your skeletal muscles will not be hot, but your belly and your digestive system will be, because your digestive system is now going through the digestion and the ingestion, the digestion, and the processes of the breakdown of food and the absorption and preparing for excretion. So then there will be an increased temperature there. There will be a highly utilization. There'll be high utilization of aerobic metabolism, as well as there will be a increased utilization of oxidative phosphorylases. So that's very important. uh, Now we need to move on to discuss something that is very important, and that is the important idea of hemoglobin, and that is the role of hemoglobin in the respiratory system. Hemoglobin is a buffer. Hemoglobin regulates for us acid base balance. So let me first talk about the very important concept of acid base balance, and then we will talk about hemoglobin. So in acid base balance, we understand very well. We understand very well that pH is a very important homeostatic variable. Just like the temperature, we have a temperature reference range. We have a temperature, physiological temperature, that is 37 degrees Celsius. That is the physiological life range. If the temperature increases beyond 37 degrees Celsius, then that constitutes hyperthermia, and that leads to stress that may lead to injury, and then cell death, and then necrosis, and then inflammation. Also, if the temperature is too low, that may lead to hypothermia, which is a form of stress that leads to tissue damage, and that leads to tissue injury, tissue death, inflammation, and so on. We have many different variables. We have a variable range for glucose level in the blood. Too much will be hyperglycemia. Too low is hypoglycemia. Just within the normal range, that is euglycemia. And there are other factors like electrolytes. There's supposed to be a set range of calcium. If that increases, that represents hypercalcemia. If that drops, that represents hypocalcemia. So the problem that I have in my blood now is the acidosis and alkalosis. I do not want acidosis. I do not want alkalosis. Both acidosis and alkalosis are very dangerous, life threatening, stressful, fatal conditions. I don't need either. I need a normal physiological range, which is a pH. A normal pH represents a pH range from 7.35 up to 7.45. That is my normal physiological range. If I go above this range, that means I'm entering alkalosis. If I am below that range, I'm entering acidosis. So there must be an integrating computer center. There must be an integrating computer center in the medulla. In the medulla. In my central nervous system, I have an integrating computer center that receives an input, and based on the input, it will generate, after integrating the input, it will generate a correcting response. So let's say in a condition, I have two patients. Patient number one has blood pH that is below 7.35. That represents what? That represents acidosis. That also represents high hydrogen proton concentration. That also represents for me high carbon dioxide concentration. So a physiological sensory stimuli will be sent an input, an input stimuli carried by an afferent neuron. An input stimuli carried by an afferent neuron, which is a sensory stimuli. This sensory stimuli is very important. Why? Because it ultimately sends in and feeds the computer in the medullary rhythmicity area in my reticular formation, which is the medulla and the pons. Over there, the sensory input, it's providing input. The arrow is pointing inward, is pointing into my computer center, is providing an input signal that says, hey, the pH has dropped below 7.35, and that is acidosis. That means the hydrogen proton concentration has increased, and that means the carbon dioxide concentration has increased. The medulla will integrate that, it will integrate that, and it will send a correcting output signal, correcting output signal through an efferent motor neuron. You see, in the sensory signal, we used an afferent neuron, but in a output signal, we used a motor neuron that is efferent. And then the efferent neuron will lead to an increase in the increasing plus, increasing the ventilation, increasing the ventilation. When we increase the ventilation, what happens is we are venting off and removing through our mouth, and from our lungs we are removing and shunting and removing away all the carbon dioxide, and that, so an increase in ventilation will lead to a decrease in carbon dioxide content in the blood, and a decreased carbon dioxide content in the blood will lead to a decrease in the hydrogen proton in the blood, and a decrease in hydrogen proton in the blood will cause the pH to increase. And when we reach, remember, the problem was we had a low pH to begin with. We had a low pH to begin with in patient one. Then that correcting signal will elevate the pH upward to the physiological range from 7.35 up until 7.45. And that correcting signal will feed back into the computer and say, hey, that's enough. We have now reached the sufficient homeostatic range of 7.35. Otherwise, if you keep sending a correcting signal, we're now going to move up through 7.45, 7.35, 7.45, 7.55. Now we're going to move up from acidosis into alkalosis. So now it's very important to discuss the opposite scenario. So the opposite scenario is patient number two who is suffering from alkalosis. So patient two who's suffering from alkalosis. So patient two is suffering from alkalosis. That means what's happening with the pH? That means the pH is high. That means the carbon dioxide is low. And that means the hydrogen proton concentration is low, and that means we have alkalosis. So the same way, we will have a sensory input signal. The sensory input signal will send um, a sensory input signal through an afferent neuron to the computer. Here, the medulla will say, oh, patient number two has the opposite. Patient number two has high pH. That's alkalosis. The patient has low carbon dioxide. The patient has low hydrogen proton. So we need to correct that. So now it will send for patient two a correcting signal through obviously an output signal through a motor neuron that will be through a afferent neuron, and that will cause the ventilation to drop. So now minus minus minus, not plus plus, as in the ventilation will be dropped. So we'll have drop in ventilation, minus 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 ventilation, and minus minus ventilation. That leads to a buildup of carbon dioxide, and that leads into an increase in acidosis, and that because there is an increase in hydrogen proton concentration. So that will lead to an increase in hydrogen proton concentration, and that will restore my pH from being so low, from the pH being so high. Then my pH in my alcohol was too high. Then my pH is going to drop because my hydrogen proton has increased. When I restore my pH level to 0.735 up to 0.745, then a feedback signal is going to be sent to my correcting computer to tell the correcting computer, hey, we have reached the physiological range. Don't bring us down all the way through 7.35, down to 7.2, 7.1, because now we will move on and transition from alkalosis to acidosis. So that is very important for you to understand. Now, let us talk about the role of, let us now talk about the role of the hemoglobin. Let's talk about the role of that hemoglobin plays, and let's talk about the Bohr's effect and the Haldane effect, which are very, very important for us. They signify for us how this hemoglobin performs its job. Imagine that oxygen was just swimming in your blood. It was not carried by hemoglobin. Imagine that in order for oxygen transport to take place, all you needed was just the oxygen to swim in the blood. Will that be effective? Actually, we do have. It's not like we don't. There is no oxygen swimming in our blood, and there is no carbon dioxide just moving, dissolved in plasma. That's not true. There is, but not this most significant amount, because the most significant amount is carried by the most significant amount is actually carried by the hemoglobin. So now let's talk about the significance of hemoglobin. The hemoglobin is very important because it carries. The hemoglobin is very important because it carries for us carbon dioxide and oxygen, but they do not carry them in the same ride. So one ride will carry for us carbon dioxide, and the other ride will carry for us oxygen. So it's very important to understand that hemoglobin is sensitive to the partial pressure. So hemoglobin will respond depending on the partial pressure. So when there is hemoglobin close to the alveoli, whose partial pressure that's high over there? That's a high oxygen partial pressure. So near the alveoli, the hemoglobin is going to be picking up, is going to be it is based on high partial pressure service. The higher your partial pressure, you will take the ride within the hemoglobin. If your partial pressure is low, you will be dropped where your partial pressure is low. But if your partial pressure is high, you will be picked up. So let's talk more about this. Let's now identify the locations. Let's now identify the locations where we have our partial pressures. We talked initially, we mentioned initially that in the alveoli, you have high partial pressure of oxygen. And we said that in the tissue, you have a low partial pressure of oxygen due to increased you have a low partial pressure of oxygen due to increased carbon dioxide generation, due to increased metabolic waste, due to increased uh, biphosphoglycerate. So this is a major problem. This is a major problem because now how does hemoglobin act? Hemoglobin will come to these two compartments. It is working between the pulmonary circulation and the tissue. The hemoglobin will come to the alveoli and find out who has a high partial pressure. Obviously, in the alveoli, the oxygen has the highest. It has a very high partial pressure and very low partial pressure for carbon dioxide. In the tissue, there is very high partial pressure for carbon dioxide and very low partial pressure of oxygen. So remember, the rule of hemoglobin is if you have a high partial pressure, you will be taken on the ride. But if you have a low partial pressure, you will be unloaded. So here, near the alveoli, that's my hemoglobin. Oxygen has a high partial pressure. It will pick up oxygen, 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 oxygen. And carbon dioxide has the low partial pressure of carbon dioxide. Then it will unload. Say, hey, carbon dioxide, get off, get off. You have a low partial pressure here. Get off here. And it will say to oxygen, you have high partial pressure. Join the ride. So now I can take you to the other compartment. When we reach the other compartment, now the situation is different. Is unlike the alveoli compartment where over there you have a high partial pressure of oxygen. Here you have a low partial pressure of oxygen. So now the hemoglobin will say to the oxygen, get off, get off. You have a low partial pressure here. Get off, get off. So now it will unload all the oxygen. So now the oxygen will be taken by your tissues to perform oxidative phosphorylation, aerobic respiration, and generate energy ATP. And then hemoglobin will see that there is a high partial pressure of carbon dioxide. It will say to carbon dioxide, "Hey, join the ride. Now let me take you back to the alveoli so you can be removed from the body. Otherwise, you will cause acidosis for us." And then hemoglobin will be taking it back. So now you understand how hemoglobin works. The curve. You really need to understand the curve. The curve is very important. In the Bohr's effect, what happens in Bohr's effect is very important. What happens in Bohr's effect is that, first of all, the normal curve is a logarithmic curve. On the x-axis, my independent variable, and on the y-axis is my dependent variable. My independent variable on the x-axis will be the partial pressure of oxygen. This is very important. The partial pressure of oxygen will be on the x-axis. And then on the y-axis, you have the percent saturation of hemoglobin with oxygen. So now you know the relationship is like a sigmoid, like this, meaning that hemoglobin will give off 97% of the oxygen. It has the ability and the capacity to remove about 97% of the oxygen that it's carrying with it. But Bohr's effect says, let's say this is the normal effect for this is the normal graph representing hemoglobin's activity, and that it will be less saturated with oxygen, where there is it will be it will be less saturated with oxygen where there is low partial pressure of oxygen. We talked about that. When there is low partial pressure of oxygen in the tissue, obviously hemoglobin will not be saturated because it will give off all the oxygen. It will not be saturated with oxygen near the tissue because the tissue needs oxygen to survive. So it will unload the oxygen. It will become less saturated with oxygen. So at low partial pressure of oxygen, I should have low saturation of hemoglobin with oxygen. But at higher partial pressures of oxygens, I should have higher saturation of hemoglobin with oxygen. That makes perfect sense because in the alveoli you have a very high partial pressure of oxygen in the alveoli, and hemoglobin over there does not need to unload oxygen to the alveoli. In fact, it needs to uptake oxygen from the alveoli. That's why it will be very saturated with oxygen. Now, what does Bohr say? Bohr's law says, this is very important. Bohr's law says, in a healthy, in a normal condition, this graph is represented in this uh, logarithmic fashion. But let's say the person is now undergoing stressful stimuli, like a drop in oxygen saturation, hypoxemia. Another stressful condition like an increase in carbon dioxide concentration. Another stressful condition like an increase in the concentration of biphosphoglycerate BPG. Another stressful condition like acidosis. Another stressful condition like the hydrogen proton concentration increase. Another stressful condition is temperature. Things are so hot. Will this graph remain the same if that person is subjected to those negative stressful stimuli? Of course not. It will shift right and down. That's very important. The Bohr graph will shift right and down. What does that signify? Shifting right and down. It means that in our graph, in order to accommodate for that stress, even though even though my partial pressure is the same, even though my partial pressure is the same, if I undergo any of these stressful conditions, I will be less saturated with oxygen because I shifted to the right and down. That means, let's just look at it here. Let's say this is about partial pressure of 30 millimeters of mercury. In a normal graph, I should be saturated, for example, 50%. So the bar graph says in a normal condition, no stress, at a partial pressure of oxygen of 30 millimeters of mercury, my hemoglobin is, for example, saturated with 50% oxygen, and 50% is gone. But if I undergo stress like hypoxemia, drop in oxygen level in the blood, and increase concentration of carbon dioxide, increase metabolites, byproducts like BPG, increase in acidosis, increase in hydrogen proton concentration, increase in temperature, drop in pH, then at that same partial pressure, if I'm undergoing any of these, what happens is at the same partial pressure, I will now be less saturated. I will now be less saturated. The bar may look like that. So at 30 millimeters of mercury, I should have been saturated with 50% oxygen. But when I am undergoing these guys at the same partial pressure, 30 millimeters of mercury, I'm now saturated with 50%. I am now saturated with 20. I'm now saturated with 20% oxygen. That means I gave off a lot of oxygen at the same partial pressure to accommodate for that stress. That's what the Bohr graph is saying. That is very important for you to understand. Bohr's law says that in the relationship between hemoglobin and oxygen, we have on the x-axis, we have our independent variable, who is the partial pressure of oxygen, and on the y-axis we have our oxygen saturation in hemoglobin. How much oxygen is saturated, how much oxygen is found in my hemoglobin, how much of my hemoglobin is saturated with oxygen. So the law is saying in normal conditions, at the same part, at one partial pressure, I should have a reasonable amount of a known amount of um, oxygen saturation. But if I undergo a stress like hypoxemia, the graph will shift to the right and downward, meaning that at that same partial pressure, now to accommodate for extra stress, I will be less saturated with oxygen because I have to dump off extra oxygen than I would have if I was in a healthy situation. But now I'm in an unhealthy situation, I'm in a stressful condition, then I will give at that same partial pressure of oxygen, I will be less saturated of oxygen and I will give off more oxygen to the tissue, and therefore I will become less saturated with oxygen in the tissue. Now let's look at the Haldane effect. Haldane effect is the same thing, but it's for the carbon dioxide. So they are two faces of the same coin. Haldane effect says the ease with which I give off oxygen, I will uptake carbon dioxide. And the ease with which I remove oxygen, I will pick up carbon dioxide. And the ease with which I will pick up oxygen, I will get rid of carbon dioxide. So remember, in the alveoli, we load oxygen and we unload carbon dioxide. Haldane effect says the easier it is for the hemoglobin to take oxygen, will translate in an easy way for carbon dioxide to be removed from the hemoglobin, because they do not stay at the same place, they do not share the same ride. So the faster I unload oxygen in the tissue, the faster at the same time I have already loaded carbon dioxide. And when I go up to the alveoli, the faster I load oxygen, it would have been the same speed. It would be not the same speed because carbon dioxide is more dissolvable and more soluble in tissue than oxygen. But it shows you that the process is synonymous. The faster you get rid of oxygen, the faster you will uptake carbon dioxide that's in the tissue. And the faster you uptake oxygen in the alveoli, that means the faster you'll get rid of carbon dioxide. Alhamdulillah, thank you. Then the faster you will, then you will, the faster you uptake oxygen, the faster you will give off carbon dioxide. Okay, something that's also very important for you to understand, that there are very important factors that influence the passage and the transport of oxygen and carbon dioxide. Remember, oxygen is a gas fluid. Oxygen is a gas fluid, and carbon dioxide is also a gas fluid. So, in order for them to move and to mobilize kinematically, they have to obey physics laws. So, let's talk about the factors now that will influence for me. The factors that will influence for me how much they will influence for me the rate at which I will be able to pass oxygen and carbon uh, oxygen and carbon dioxide. Okay, so the first factor is solubility. The more soluble you are, the faster you will be able to, the more soluble you are, the faster you will be able to dissolve in blood. So we know that carbon dioxide has the highest solubility. So number one is the solubility coefficient. Has the highest solubility coefficient. So these are the factors that determine the rate of diffusion, because we have oxygen diffusing from the alveoli into the blood capillary, and we have diffusing from carbon dioxide diffusing from the capillaries into the alveoli. So the more soluble you are means the higher your solubility coefficient. That means the better your the better you the faster the rate of your diffusion will be. The second thing is the medium we are passing through. So imagine you have a patient whose lung is fibrotic. There's fibrosis in the lung. Imagine the patient has pneumothorax, or the patient has edema, pulmonary edema. Do you think the diffusion rate will not be affected? Of course, it will be affected negatively. So that means we have to make sure that our medium is not pathologically impaired, because that will slow the rate of diffusion, and any delay in the rate of diffusion means that carbon dioxide will stay longer than it should be in the blood, causing acidosis, and oxygen will take a longer time to make its way into the blood. That is delaying the acidosis. Another very important factor is also the the partial pressure. So the higher the partial pressure of a certain gas, and the higher the concentration of the certain gas, will ensure that the gas will the process of the gas diffusing will be sped up. And then we also, number four, we have molecular mass. So the denser, obviously, and the heavier and the more mass you have in the tissue, the more mass in the tissue, the more mass that's there in the gas shows you that it will be slower in diffusion. I would like to now end with the very important Boyle's law. So Boyle's law now shows us how in your respiratory system there is a full utilization. There is a full utilization of anatomical rearrangements. There are very important anatomical rearrangements that take place in order to ensure that this air, the oxygen and carbon dioxide, make their way in the right places that they are supposed to be in. Okay, so Boyle's law says at a constant temperature, a perfect example of a constant temperature is physiological temperature, 37 degrees Celsius. If it is not constant, then this is not homeostasis. Homeostasis is means homeo means the same, stasis mean constant, which means staying constant by staying the same. So the temperature is 37 degrees Celsius. And we know from Gen Chem, PV equals nRT. When we remove N and R, because we're dealing with that same gas, we have now conceptually, if you have P times V, if you increase the pressure, the volume will decrease. And if you decrease the pressure, the volume will increase. Or you could do the opposite. You could decrease the volume and the pressure will increase, or you could increase the volume and the pressure will decrease. In the end, the relationship is my constant temperature will lock in place for me a relationship that is inverse between the volume and the pressure. So let's say I'm trying to take a deep breath. Say these are my lungs. So in order for air to come in order for air to move in this direction, that means the atmospheric pressure has to be the highest. The atmospheric pressure has to be the highest. And then the pressure in the alveoli, P alv, alveolar pressure, P alv. And then there is a third kind of pressure known as PIP. PIP. PIP is intrapleural pressure. Intrapleural pressure. And P alv is alveolar pressure. What happens is air will enter from the high atmospheric pressure through the lungs and will be drawn to the alveolar pressure, and then it will hit the corner of the lung where you have the least pressure value of pressure in the inhalation, which is the PIP, the intrapleural pressure. Then you will have the exchange between the alveoli and then the alveoli and the capillaries, and then blood will be sent back to the right heart and all that circulation. What we need to know is when we need to inhale, there are some anatomical rearrangements that must happen volume wise. Anatomical rearrangements that must happen volume wise in order to modulate the pressure. I know air has to go into my lungs. That means I must make the pressure within my lungs small so air can flow in inhalation. So in inhalation, what happens is your diaphragm, remember, in the respiratory system, we talked about upper respiratory tract and lower respiratory tract. These are not the only important structures of your respiratory system. You also have accessory respiratory organs. No system can function on its own. Every physiological system needs accessory organs. Your digestive system needs the pancreas, which is an um, accessory organ. It needs the liver, an accessory organ. It needs the bile duct. It's an accessory organ. These are all very important accessory organs. So one of your important accessory organs in the respiratory system is the diaphragm, and also in addition to the diaphragm, there is also the intercostal muscles, and there's the sternocleidomastoid muscle and also the scalene muscles. But now let's stick with the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles. What happens? Your brain will send action potentials to the diaphragm. When it's inhalation time, it will tell the diaphragm relax. Be very careful the distinction between a relaxed diaphragm and a contracted diaphragm. What does a relaxed diaphragm mean? A relaxed diaphragm means a diaphragm that moves down. That's a contracted diaphragm. A contracted diaphragm moves down. Contracted diaphragm moves down. And a diaphragm that moves up is a relaxed diaphragm. So when I want to inhale, if I want to inhale, that means I want air to go into my lungs. So if I want air to go into my lungs, that means I have to make the pressure here low. And if I want to make the pressure low, that means I have to make the volume high. So I have to make the chamber of my respiratory system wide and increase the volume. How do I increase the volume? By contracting the diaphragm, by sending electrical action potential into the diaphragm, bringing the diaphragm down, increasing the volume, and also the intercostal muscles will receive action potentials that cause them to expand, and that leads to an increased transverse diameter of the rib cage. And that is an overall huge increase in the volume. And the volume increased a lot. That means the pressure went down and air would flow in so smoothly and nicely. What if I want to do the opposite? Now I want to exhale. So in exhalation, I want the air out. That means I need to have high pressure in my respiratory system to propel the air out, and then I need to have a low volume. So what I have here is action potentials will come from the brain and will tell my diaphragm to relax. And the diaphragm will relax by going up and compressing against my lungs, making them tighter. And then action potentials will also, after coming to the diaphragm, making it relax and press against the lungs and making the volume smaller and the pressure tighter and higher. There will be action potential to the intercostal muscles that will decrease the transverse diameter of the thoracic rib cage, and that will lead to an overall transverse decrease of my respiratory system chambers, and that will drop the volume of my respiratory system, leading to a high pressure. And then this high pressure will cause the gas fluid to obey the physics of moving from an area of high pressure to an area of a higher pressure, even higher than the atmospheric pressure, and then the air will move out into the atmospheric pressure. So that is a very important association between Boyle's law and respiration. Also, remember that in the air, nitrogen is about 78%, and oxygen is only 20%. Um, Nitrogen is 78% and oxygen is 20%. So Charles' law says if you have oxygen in the air phase and you have a bucket of water and then you have a small cup of water, and no matter what size of water you have, and but in the atmosphere you will always have 21% oxygen and you will have 78% nitrogen. You can have all sizes, all different sizes of a water solution. What happens is there will be equilibrium. If you can't, there will be equilibrium between the oxygen dissolved in air and the oxygen dissolved in the water. So if you count all the single oxygen 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 atoms dissolved in solution, they will represent 21%, the same way they used to be 21% in air, they will be 21% in solution. 21% in air, they will be 21% in this solution. 21% in air, they will be 21% in this solution. And that is Charles' law. So that's a very important overview of major concept that we can just keep going over and over. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments. Thank you very much, and I'll see you in our next topic.